The Chinese impression is that they are willing to at least negotiate, not necessarily on Donald Trump's terms, but to talk. But their impression is that the U.S. has not opened channels and not made an effort to open up channels.
Have you ever heard of a great superpower losing control right under its nose while the whole world laughs behind its back? Imagine it, March 2025, Washington, D.C., the House of Representatives. Donald Trump stands at the podium and declares, "We are annexing Greenland, no matter what it takes." At these words, millions held their breath. Greenland, once just a white spot on the map, had suddenly become the key to world domination.
Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with.
But just a few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Greenland, without hesitation, struck the US in the heart by signing a $3 billion contract not with America, but with Canada. At that moment, new hopes were kindled in the icy expanses of Greenland, while alarm bells rang in Washington.
In other words, pre-substitution, if we just continue as we are now. But of course, people will start to substitute. They will find other goods. And as the Christmas Tree Association said a moment or two ago, it's going to be very difficult to find substitution of many things that we currently get from China.
While the US demanded, threatened, and planned to deploy radars, Canada remained silent, listened, met behind closed doors, and signed documents that would change the balance of power in the world for decades to come. This is not just a contract for the extraction of molybdenum, a rare metal needed for the production of electric vehicles, missiles, and missile defense systems. It is the key to green energy and defense in Europe.
The higher the tariff, the more likely it is to have them come into the country.
The higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to pay in shops.
America thought it was the only one capable of holding the world by the throat by cutting off supplies of rare earth metals. But this time things did not go according to plan. With one deal, Canada has joined the club of strategic powers, taking from the US what they were willing to fight for.
But it's also an opening to say, okay, we're capping this for now, and that perhaps offers a way forward that we could begin talking about how to bring these down.
Few people know that Greenland hides the world's largest deposits of molybdenum, and control over them means control over the production of combat drones, hypersonic missiles, and electric vehicles, for which a real silent war is being waged. Ford, GM, and Lockheed Martin are already sounding the alarm because the loss of these supplies could halt entire assembly lines and next-generation weapons development programs.
Surveys like the Michigan survey, consumer sentiment, and it's a really worrying number because at some point these sentiment surveys feed into hard data of real consumer spending, and we know this from history and precedent. That's what happens. So when we see a number as bad as this one, it is only a matter of time, unless anything else changes that would suddenly make people more cheerful. Look at that chart. I mean, just look at it. Unless people suddenly become more cheerful, why would this not translate into spending? You see, that consumer lab, the lab from Yale, that number of 4,700, that is providing you don't start substituting goods.
While America was removing Greenland from its list of allies with threats and sanctions, Canada offered a simple deal: jobs for locals, a share of profits for education and healthcare, and compliance with environmental standards. And Greenland chose Canada, and with it a future free from the dictates of a single country.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
Europe, France, Germany, and Norway unanimously supported the deal, creating the Arctic Green Alliance, to which the US was not even invited. France sent its submarines to the shores of Greenland to show that the alliance would be fiercely defended if the US tried to interfere. The irony is that part of the investment in Canadian projects came from American funds, and now America is financing its own removal from the Arctic.
To allow that. So now you have the U.S. president say, well, I'm not going to open those channels. China has to open them first. It's kind of ridiculous at the end of the day, because you are playing with the interests of American consumers, Chinese consumers, etc. The other point I would make about China's reaction today in not quite meeting the U.S. tariffs, 145% U.S., China goes to 125. And in Xi's statement, he says, we're going to 125 in response. That's as high as we're going because this is getting a little ridiculous, right? And that's both a signal to say we're not going to get caught up in this tit for tat to the degree that the president is.
This is a story about how a country that is called quiet and inconspicuous can win the biggest game on the world chessboard without making a single loud statement. This is a story about how, in a world where the sound of weapons is growing louder, those who know how to listen win. Greenland, Canada, the US, and Europe are all in the same game, and the stakes are higher than ever. Today, we will tell you why this deal could be a turning point for the entire world.
Right now, 145 going up against 125. These are the tariffs between the world's two biggest economies.
And here's another number, 4,700, or about $400 per month. That is how much more money Yale's now estimating, the Yale Budget Lab, that President Trump's tariffs are going to cost average households each year. And with just hours left in trading, the Dow right now.
March 2025 will be remembered as the moment when America made its ambitions so loud that the echoes reached the icy bays of Greenland. On that day, Donald Trump, newly elected president, stood at the podium of Congress and did not simply deliver a speech, but issued a challenge to the world when he declared, "We will annex Greenland at any cost." At that moment, even some senators could not contain their surprise, and in Europe, EU Council meetings were hastily adjourned to translate and discuss the speech. Graphs appeared on television screens around the world showing how the icy island, once considered empty and nameless, was now becoming a key point on the global chessboard. But few understood at the time that behind this loud rhetoric lay cold calculation. For Greenland harbored resources capable of changing the global energy and defense balance.
Yeah, you'll be surprised just how much we get exclusively from China. And Jim, I'm really curious to get your perspective on the White House's handling of this situation. Not so much the tariffs that have been announced, but this reporting that the White House, that officials have made clear to Beijing that they want Xi to ask for a call with Trump.
It was here that the world's largest deposits of molybdenum, graphite, and rare earth metals, necessary for the creation of electric vehicles, combat drones, and hypersonic missiles, were located. Although this was not publicly acknowledged, the Pentagon had already drawn up a secret plan called Northern Umbrella, which involved the creation of a network of radars and reconnaissance drones along the coast of Greenland to close a vulnerability in the US missile defense system that was known only to a small circle of military advisors. Among the documents that later leaked to the media was a map showing glacier areas marked in red as possible locations for advanced missile defense systems and hypersonic installations. But at that point, the US did not understand that Greenland had no intention of giving up its land without a fight, even a diplomatic one.
We shouldn't be surprised with all that's coming out and all the worries about tariffs. It's not just that, it's the complexity of everything else as well. The changes within the federal government, the worries about job losses, the worries about a slowing economy, higher inflation, and eventually you get these...
When Trump made his statement, the Prime Minister of Greenland responded that Greenland is not for sale. But behind the scenes, behind closed doors, much tougher negotiations were underway. American corporations such as Lockheed Martin and General Motors had already begun preparing contracts, promising investments and jobs, but with the proviso that taxes would be minimal and labor and environmental standards would be adjusted to suit the corporations. At the same time, according to unconfirmed reports, a private meeting between US representatives and major American mining companies with Danish diplomats ended in a loud quarrel, when the American side allegedly demanded preferential port leases for 50 years in exchange for promises of investment. The Americans believed that power and money would open any door, and that Greenland, fearing the loss of a rare opportunity for development, would agree to their terms. At that moment, Washington was already preparing speeches about a new era of dominance in the Arctic, and the Pentagon was considering the possibility of conducting exercises off the coast of Greenland to demonstrate its power.
lived in China. You've covered China for some time now. As we're looking at this question of who's going to blink first, with two very different political systems, what is your gauge on this?
Well, different systems, listen, one's a democracy, one is not. One's a single-party state, very much not a democracy. But China does have politics, and Chinese leaders do not want to be seen, we were talking about this yesterday, I believe, do not want to be seen as capitulating to America. That is not good politics for a Chinese leader.
But while the US was trying to act loud and aggressive, a completely different strategy was being developed in Ottawa, in the closed offices of the new Canadian Prime Minister. There were no grandiose statements, no threats, no showy actions. Armed with patience and a dossier detailing Greenland's internal politics, Canadian diplomats began to take small but precise steps. They knew that it was important for Greenland to preserve its identity and independence, so they proposed a unique plan. 70% of jobs in future projects would be reserved for local residents. 10% of profits would go to the Greenland Future Fund, which would be invested in education and healthcare, and environmental standards would be brought into line with EU norms. But there was also a secret clause that no one officially announced. In the event of a threat from third countries, Canada and the EU would be ready to defend Greenland diplomatically, using their influence in the UN and international courts to prevent it from being turned into a military base for a superpower.
Up. You're seeing that swing here going into the afternoon, up almost 650 points. But it was up and down there throughout earlier in the day. With us now, we have CNN business editor-at-large Richard Quest. We have CNN chief national security analyst Jim Sciutto as well. Richard, a key economic gauge, the consumer sentiment now at its second lowest level on record, going back to 1952. Why?
While the US was preparing further sanctions and statements, Greenland began to realize that it had a chance to break out of the shadow of the big players and become an independent player in world politics. And it was Canada that offered them this path. In May 2025, information leaked to the media that a delegation from Greenland had secretly flown to Toronto to conclude a framework agreement that provided for multi-billion-dollar investments in the mining sector, the creation of transport infrastructure, and educational programs for local youth. During the negotiations, the Canadian side even offered to help train Greenlanders to operate drones to monitor glaciers, which would allow them to control their own territory rather than relying on satellite images from foreign countries.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, "Of course, I'm going to respond." And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent Mary Bruce leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
This was humiliating for the US. The Pentagon had to urgently revise its strategic plans for the Arctic, and American companies began to pressure Washington to intervene as they risked losing access to critical metals. Rumors appeared in the media that American lobbyists had offered Denmark secret payments for supporting the annexation, but Denmark, fearing public outrage, refused. Meanwhile, Canada was already building a network of alliances. France sent its nuclear submarines to Baffin Bay to demonstrate its support for its allies. Germany proposed joint projects to produce electric vehicles using Greenlandic resources via Canada, and Norway opened a fund allocating €500 million to the development of green energy, with the mandatory participation of Canada and Greenland.
Wolf, they did fall on deaf ears, but it's just the latest example in the really day by day, the deepening trade war that is underway between the United States and China. Yes, we are learning that U.S. officials privately behind the scenes urged China to not retaliate. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been saying that publicly all along, warning countries to not retaliate. Well, those warnings have fallen on deaf ears, particularly with China, as they raised their tariffs to 125%. The question now is which side is going to blink?
Greenland, which yesterday was perceived as a deserted Iceland, has turned into a battlefield where the key to green energy and technological leadership is being decided. And it was at this moment that Canada showed the world that soft power can be stronger than any threat, and that trust is more valuable than any investment. This was not just a deal, it was a step that changed the map of influence in the Arctic and presented the US with a fact: sometimes silence speaks louder than any speech. And real power does not require shouting or sanctions. Greenland chose the future, and Canada showed the world that sometimes, to win the global game, you don't need to push, but to listen and act in the shadows. While the whole world watched the loud statements of the US and the underground maneuvers of Canada, a real internal revolution was brewing in Greenland, quiet and deep, like ice cracks underfoot. While American companies waited for orders from Washington and drew up expansion plans, a crisis council was being formed in Greenland's capital, Nuuk, made up of local leaders, young entrepreneurs, and lawyers who understood that if they did not seize this moment, they would forever remain an appendage to someone else's plans. It was in these offices that the idea of creating an independent investment commission was first mooted, which would approve all deals with foreign companies based not on the interests of big players, but on the long-term interests of Greenland. This step, which the press only learned about later, was a response to a situation in which major powers were fighting over resources, forgetting that there were people living under the ice who wanted to educate their children, develop their universities, and be able to decide the fate of their own land. Canada immediately picked up on this signal. A closed committee was set up in Toronto under the Ministry of Natural Resources, whose task was not simply to sign a contract, but to build trust. It included economists, lawyers, and even representatives of Canada's Indigenous peoples who understood that the local people of Greenland would not accept the usual promises and figures in contract. There was heated debate within Canada because some businesses wanted more control and profits, but the country's new leadership stood its ground. Greenland must feel that it is not a commodity. As part of these negotiations, the concept of the Green Arctic Alliance was developed, in which each participating country committed to investing in Greenland's education and health programs, allocating at least 15% of net profits to a climate adaptation fund, and using local labor in extraction projects. It was this proposal, which the world later learned about, that prompted the question in Nuuk: why not choose Canada instead of the US? Meanwhile, behind the scenes in the US, panic set in. American lobbyists tried to get Denmark to join in pressuring Greenland, offering investments in Danish transport infrastructure, and promising contracts for the supply of military equipment. But Copenhagen understood that a wave of popular discontent would crush any government that tried to impose its will on Greenland. At the same time, some Pentagon experts in the US began to warn that Greenland's refusal could lead to vulnerabilities in the country's northern defenses, and the leak to the press of plans to deploy secret radar stations on the Greenland coast was a real disaster for the US image, sparking protests in Europe and scandals within NATO. In contrast to this chaos, Canada acted like a chess player thinking 10 moves ahead. In one of the rare comments leaked to the media, a Canadian diplomat said, "We are not buying Greenland, we are becoming its partner." These words became a slogan for everyone in Europe who was following the negotiations. While the US lost trust, Germany and France sided with Canada, offering joint projects to produce electric vehicles and wind turbines using Greenlandic molybdenum and graphite mined by Canadian companies with the participation of Greenlandic workers. Behind the scenes of the negotiations in Brussels, complex discussions were taking place, with Germany demanding guarantees of raw material supplies and France offering military protection of supply routes, including submarine patrols off the coast of Greenland. In exchange, Canada offered discounts on gas and green energy supplies to Europe, creating a sustainable energy network that would gradually reduce Europe's dependence on supplies from the US and China. It was at this point that the idea of creating the Arctic Green Fund was born, which included Germany, France, Norway, and Canada, with a capital of $3.1 billion. Without the participation of the US, but with the active participation of Greenlandic representatives who were given the right to veto key projects. This fund became a tool for building infrastructure in Greenland: ports, scientific laboratories, training centers, and climate monitoring centers, where Greenlandic youth learned to use drones and satellite technology to track ice melt and the environmental condition of mineral extraction regions. These initiatives have allowed Greenland to feel in control of its own destiny for the first time in decades, rather than simply watching foreign companies extract resources and leave behind a devastated landscape. Meanwhile, in the US, a wave of criticism has emerged against the administration, which has been accused of missing a strategic opportunity to strengthen its position in the Arctic. American corporations such as Ford and General Motors warned that without access to Greenland's molybdenum, electric vehicle production in the US would become more expensive, which could hurt domestic green energy stimulus programs. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon reported delays in programs to develop hypersonic systems and upgrade radar systems because the raw materials they were counting on became unavailable after Canada's deal with Greenland. There were even rumors that some US investments through private funds went to Canadian projects, ironically financing the success of a rival in the Arctic. And all this was happening against the backdrop of a new era unfolding in Greenland. Posters appeared on the streets of Nuuk with slogans saying that Greenland was choosing the future, and universities discussed the possibility of creating the first fully independent research programs to develop local mineral extraction technologies in order to break away from dependence on foreign contractors. Canada offered technical assistance in setting up such programs, supplying equipment and joint research grants. This was a blow to the US's position in the region, as it had previously been considered the only possible technological partner for Greenland. In the end, it was silence, diplomacy, and respect for independence that became Canada's weapons in the battle for the Arctic, which proved more important than the tens of billions of dollars in investments with which the US tried to buy loyalty. And while the world watched the latest loud statements and threats, a quiet revolution was taking place on the map of influence in the Arctic, in which Greenland went from being an object of struggle to a subject of decisions. Canada emerged as the new leader in the region, and the US became a symbol of how even a great power can lose if it stops listening to those it considers weak. Canada, which had gradually transformed itself from a quiet neighbor into a key player in the Arctic, understood that the contract with Greenland was only the beginning of a much larger game where not only the future of strategic supplies was at stake, but also the model of how wars are won in the 21st century without a single shot being fired. When the dust settled around the molybdenum deals, Canada began to consolidate its new role by building alliances with Europe, bringing Norway and Denmark on board, and creating a belt of trust around itself that the US simply could not enter, even if it wanted to.